Well, I've told you about the King family, and now I'm going to tell you about the family of Christopher Busch. His father was H. Lee Busch, a prominent vice president with General Motors, generally involved with international finance, which kept him in and out of the country on a regular basis. They had four sons: David, Charles, John, and Chris, and Charles is the only one who's alive today. Chris, as I understand it, was substantially younger than his three brothers. The Bushes had a home in Bloomfield Township and a cottage at S Lake up outside of Hillman, Michigan, and that's ESS, not a single letter S. John had two sons, Brent and Scott. Both of them were interviewed by the investigators and acknowledged that they were abused by their Uncle Chris. So the family knew about Chris's predilection for pedophilia and had had experiences in their own family. Charles was interviewed by the FBI and was initially reluctant to be interviewed. And when he was interviewed, the first thing he said was he did not want any publicity about his brother. And if there was going to be publicity, he wanted advance notice so he could put his nephews, Brent and Scott, into a protection program. Well, that was an interesting observation, and I haven't talked to anybody yet that can tell me why or how you achieve that. Somebody ought to talk to Charles and find out what he was afraid of. As you're going to find, as you discussed in the suicide report, there's some concerns that his brother Chris was murdered instead of committing suicide. Was the family concerned about murders? I don't know. Charles has the answer. He's the person who can tell us why he made that request. And if you want to know who Christopher Busch is, the best reading we found in the Michigan State Police reports was the conversation he had with the investigating officers on the trip in January of 1977 from his business in Alma, Michigan, to the Genesee County Circuit Court in Flint the day of the polygraph examination. He was very verbose. He acknowledged that he was a pedophile, acknowledged he had a problem. There wasn't any secret about that. Said it started at 17 when he went to boarding school in England. And his father, as I told you, was overseas quite a bit of the time. He told the investigating officers about a program that he and Gregory Green had talked about, where one of them would get a daytime job and the other one would get a nighttime job, so when they found victims, they could keep an eye on them. He also indicated a desire to tie up a boy and abuse him. Now, these are voluntary statements from Busch to the police officers, not even in response to questions on the subject. Very scary. And you'll recall that both Mark Stebbins and Mark and my son Tim had indications of being tied up when they found their bodies. He mentioned that he'd had activities with at least 30 boys, and the word 100 appears in another part of the program. Between 17 and 25, that's a pretty remarkable record. Maybe not as good as Wilt Chamberlain's, but an indication that he was very active in pedophile activities. And it's surprising to me that reports are not in existence from other parents who may have found out about this indications from him. And he was asked where he found his victims. He mentioned three places: the place where Mark Stebbins' body was found, the place where Christine Mihalik's body was found, and the place where Jill Robinson's body was found. Coincidence? Perhaps. I think it's very unlikely that that would be a part of the program. And also, those initial investigation stories indicate that Gregory Green told the police investigators that Christopher Busch had murdered Mark Stebbins. I don't find anything in the 3,411 pages where the police ever followed up with Greg Green about the basis of that statement. And that surprises me somewhat. But I think that short period of time on the drive from Alma to Flint tells you more about who Christopher Busch was, at least in the areas that we're concerned, than any other extensive source. His nephew Brent was interviewed by the police and said he was talking to Uncle Chris one time and said, well, where was Tim King picked up? He said Uncle Chris put him in the car, drove a short distance, and said, right here is where Tim King was picked up. Now, I don't know if he took him to the Hunter Maple Pharmacy or not, but you don't, if it was true, he took him to wherever Tim was picked up and he knew where it was. The investigator said to him, Brent, how do you remember that? And he said, quote, you don't forget things like that, end quote. Another shocking part of the Busch family was a story that Vince Gunnels told the police, and he also told Chris and I when we interviewed him in October of 2011. He said that a lady in a limousine stopped him on the street in Flint and tried to give him some money not to testify in the pedophile cases up in Montmorency County and Midland County. There's no indication in the Michigan State Police files that there was any follow-up on that. If you and I tried to bribe somebody not to testify in a criminal case, we'd make the headlines. The Busch family, a little bit higher, maybe up on the financial totem pole, and that doesn't happen. Now, we need further information from Charles about the family. Charles did tell the FBI that his dad, before he died, destroyed all the family records. He did not recall any discussions about Christopher being involved in the Oakland County child killings, but I'd be extremely interested to know what the family thought about his pedophile activities. Did the family condone them? Or did they punish him? What would you do in your family if you found out that one of your children was abusing one of your grandchildren? Charles ought to be brought back, put under oath, and made to testify. And we had one other contact regarding the family of Christopher Busch, and that was in December of 2011. I got a letter from Richard Lawson, an inmate in prison for life because he was guilty of a murder. Mr. Lawson had called me some 15 or 20 years earlier saying he had some leads on my son's death. And I went out to Macomb County, where he was in jail at the time, with two of my friends from the Birmingham Police Department. My interpretation of what he wanted to talk about was a bunch of hooey trying to get out of jail. But my friends, the police officers, did file a report, and he said he wanted to talk to me about the case. I called up Rob Moran, the Wayne County prosecutor, and asked him for his reaction. And he told me, as I had understood prior to then, that Lawson was sort of a double agent. He was working for as a snitch for the government. At the same time, he was running criminal activities, including the pedophile activities on Cass Avenue in Detroit. And Rob said to me, Barry, he's very unreliable, but he has provided us with information that was helpful to us on occasions, and he suggested that I go out and talk to him. Well, I was reluctant to do that because I didn't want to get emotional, and I asked Dave Binkley of my law firm if he would go out and talk to Mr. Lawson. And Dave did make that trip, and he's going to tell you about the results now.
Going to see Richard Lawson was really pretty remarkable because besides the reasons that you and I had talked about for us wanting to see him, in addition, the task force, Gary Gray, and Livonia PD were also very interested in finding out what Lawson had to say. A lot of that came from the first opportunity to speak to Lamborghini and, the availability I had to go in, not under the color of law as a law enforcement. So, I made the appointment through Department of Corrections to interview Lawson and went out there on the appointed day.
And what happened then?
Well, in addition to the agenda of things that you and I really wanted to pursue with him, the task force had also given me a list of things that they wanted to find out. And they were really after me to say, well, we've got to give him certain protections, but you don't, which was a theme for the whole civil litigation. So he anticipated me being there, and we started talking, and, he wants to dominate the conversation. When I finally got him to refocus on, the reason I was there, that's when he started telling me about the two basic circles of pedophiles, the group in the Cass Corridor and then the group out here in Birmingham. That discussion devolved from time to time, and I kept trying to refocus him on Busch, because by this point we were thinking about Busch and not so much Ted Lamborghini, although that was still my focus at the time.
And what did he tell you about the Busch involvement?
Well, at first, the background was there's a group of pedophiles in the Cass Corridor, and they had this orbit that took them out to Royal Oak in Birmingham. And Lawson described for me providing victims, to Busch's father. And that Busch's father was recruiting Lawson and that gang of pedophiles down there to provide boys for Busch's father. He seemed to minimize Chris Busch's participation in our case, and was really more focused, I thought, on nailing Busch's father. And again, because of whatever mental illness or disease or delusion that he was under, he would leave the discussion from time to time and go off in some crazy tangent. So substantively, I came away with the notion of new facts that we discussed when I got back. As you recall, were Busch's father, who we thought might have been kind of neutral or, concerned about this crazy, sick individual son that he had. And now we were starting to look more at sort of this familial illness with this group of pedophiles. It was disgusting. It was really eerie, and Lawson talked about it almost in terms of, business transactions, finding boys and providing boys, and the quid pro quo of them providing boys back to the Cass Corridor group. Really sick stuff.